Welcome to our 10th annual Circle of Dialogue. It's nice to have you with us. My name is Allen Jorgenson. I teach systematic theology at Martin Luther University College, and I want to give Mona Tokarek LaFosse a moment to introduce herself too.
Hi, my name is Mona, and I am the Assistant Professor of Christian Scriptures and Sacred Texts at Luther.
We're especially pleased to have with us today Garrison and Dave. Garrison McCleary teaches at Conestoga College, and Dave Skene serves as co-executive director at White Owl Native Ancestry Association.
So we're really glad to be able to have you here today and talk with you about Indigenous food sovereignty. Thought we'd start by asking you a little bit about more about who you are and how you came to do this work. Dave, would you like to start?
Yep, sure. Yeah, I'm from Métis descent. My mom is Métis, my father Scottish, and Skene is a Scottish name, as I just said. It means little knife. But I grew up in my mother's mother's and her mother's home. So I grew up with my grandmothers and my great grandmothers, Métis women, and their husbands. And so I grew up in a Métis home and a little bit in a extended family community, Métis extended family community. So I identify much more with my Métis heritage than my Scottish heritage, although there's lots of awesome things about being Scottish. So I'm married to Liz. I've been married for, I think it's 36 years or something like that. I'll have to figure it out, but I'm not going to do that now. And I work with White Owl Native Ancestry Association. It's a funny name for an organization, but I think mostly it represents that it was created in 1975, or yeah, 1975. So it's an old organization, and I think the name doesn't really represent what we do now, because we do a lot of different things, but we definitely don't help people find their native ancestry, which is like a lot of phone calls we get. but yeah, like my role there is mainly in I'm the co-executive director. There's two of us that are directing and sharing that responsibility. And my main responsibilities within the co-directorship is around food and land sovereignty and land-based education. And then I also am involved where Garrison and I kind of connect is through another Indigenous organization, a collective called Wasakta Winawak Garden Collective. And so that's a group of Indigenous scholars, researchers, students, community members, all involved across Waterloo, Wellington regions, who are involved in urban Indigenous food sovereignty. But I'd also like to acknowledge my ancestors as well, to connect with my ancestors. And so my Métis heritage comes up through the Laurendale, Dusome, Minor, and Brissette families. And mainly all of them eventually came from the West and then settled in and around Penetanguishene. And so I make that statement because it's really important, I think, to recognize our ancestors as in the work that we do, but also because everywhere I go, I find cousins. So I like to throw out the names so I can find more cousins. And then just last part of my introduction is, and relates to the whole idea of why I do what I do, is that to be Métis, in my understanding, Métis is not so much a noun as it is a verb, in the sense that the word is not necessarily to separate us from other people, or it's more the idea of to be Métis is how we live. And I would carry that in to say, like, to be Indigenous is how we live. It's it's the actions that we apply to our lives. And so as I kind of started understanding that a little bit more deeper in my a little bit midlife, it led me into trying to figure out, or it led me into this question, which was really like, how do we as Indigenous people living in an urban center live a land-based life? And for us as Indigenous people, our identity is connected to land, and not just connected, it's really rooted in land. So we understand who we are by our relationship with the land that we're on. And so I had that question from a pretty much an urban Indigenous person. How am I connected to the land? How am I drawing my identity out of the land? And so I had that question, and I started meeting people with the same question. And one of the easiest things, I think, for us to do, and the simplest thing for us to do, was we just started growing food as a part of that answer. And so connecting ourselves to the land, and then connecting ourselves to the food that we eat. So I did that before, like, it wasn't a strategy in the sense of an employment strategy, or we didn't have funding or anything like that. And just in conversation, just kind of said, yeah, like we should be growing a garden. So we started one, small one. A small 10 by 10 plot is what we started with, and we've kind of grown from there. Anyway, that's as far as I'll go. I'll turn it over to Garrison.
Dave always forgets to talk about how he's also doing a PhD.
Yeah, I'm also doing a PhD, and my focus is on Indigenous food and land sovereignty, and we'll talk more, give you a little bit more definition on what that means a little later.
Thank
Right.
you very much. Garrison.
Bonjour, wasiab mikna ndishnakas, wabashishi and odem, gwalfandun jaba, kitchen and Diane. My name is Garrison McCleary, my English name. My traditional name is Wasiab Mikna. Yeah, I grew up in Guelph, Ontario, now live in Kitchener. My ancestry, I come from mixed ancestry. My mother's side of the family is Lenape, Indigenous, and African American or African Canadian, depending on what point in time in history you are talking about family members. And my father's side of the family is Scottish, Irish, and Welsh. And then we also have some English, but we don't talk very much about that side of the family. Anyway, yeah, and so I come from a long line of mixed ancestry, and a part of what I've been doing and a lot of the work as I walk and live my life and lift up my teachings and where I'm situated in the circle is about navigating that. And for a lot of urban Indigenous youth, that's a question and a history that they're also trying to navigate. And that's becoming more of a narrative of mixed ancestry in urban spaces. So that's something that I'm definitely walking and that informs me. And all of those different ancestries and the ancestors that come from those places are also walking with me and informing me. As I said, I grew up in Guelph, Ontario. My mother is a social worker, and I also ended up going to school to be a social worker. I did my undergraduate degree at University of Waterloo, and then my master's degree in the Indigenous field of study at Laurier, and then now currently doing my doctorate degree in social work as well at Wilfrid Laurier. And you know, all of these things that my mother had been teaching me and my family had been teaching me, I really helped informed where I'm going. And social work has very much been a way of being able to connect and make relationship and understanding relationship more deeply. I grew up a lot. I grew up in the northeast end of Guelph, right near Guelph Lake Conservation Area. I used to be the last street out of Guelph. It's not so much the last street anymore, but it used to be the last street before farm fields. So I spent a lot of time outside, and I started understanding the relationships that were going on in the land. I'd bring my field guide down, or go and build dams in the water in the river, Speed River, or go biking or fishing, edible wilds and stuff like that. And as I started to grow up and as I went into social work, I started to realize that social work is just really ecology for humans. It's how we interact with each other, and how we interact with the land around us. And I worked for quite some time, about 10 years, for the Grand River Conservation Authority, doing outdoor education programming for them, before I went into social work practice. Again, my social work practice is not traditional social work from a Western perspective. It's very much a traditional social work from an Indigenous perspective, I guess you could say. Really seeing the land as being the facilitators of healing, whether that's through ceremony, or just access to land. So a lot of that for me has really informed my walk, and seeking out relationship with the land, and also with the teachers and elders and community members and uncles and stuff like that, like Dave, to continue those connections. So that's kind of what I'm doing now. I just recently was appointed a faculty position at Conestoga College in Indigenous Studies, and really working on building up that program from a land-based perspective, and moving outside of just seeing Indigenous studies as a history course, but seeing it as a practical, modern and contemporary coursework that is situated on the land that can provide some very important conversations around sustainability, and the path forward for not only Indigenous people, but non-Indigenous people in terms of living in relationship with the land, and combating climate change and other social concerns. Yeah, that's me.
Thank you both for introducing us to your very busy lives. You know, you're both have a lot of balls in the air. Very impressive. So Indigenous food sovereignty, can you just tell us a bit about what these three words mean together?
I'll do something fairly brief, and then Garrison can probably beef it up a little bit. So I've had a question of like, what is food sovereignty or land sovereignty, or really like the word sovereignty, and why we use that word sovereignty. Because I think it comes with kind of like baggage, you know. It's a strong word that in my head anyways relates to more governance and kind of like, yeah, crown and federal governments and stuff like that when we use that word sovereignty. And so I've kind of been trying to, and this is often the way I operate, is I take some of these concepts and kind of bring them down to a level where it's very understandable for me. And so I've begun to understand sovereignty, not necessarily from the definition, but just as I've talked to Indigenous leaders and elders, that sovereignty really just is simply the idea that we are responsible. And so when we say Indigenous food sovereignty, the easiest way to understand it for me is that what we're saying is Indigenous people being responsible for their own food, and therefore being responsible for the land that they grow that food on, and being responsible for our own health. And then food also is culture. So it also brings in the fact, and land and food are both the basis of our culture. So again, responsible for our culture. And then our language also is rooted in land and food as well. So again, being responsible for language. And it's kind of crazy when you think about it, like for us as Indigenous people, Métis and First Nations and Inuit, we seem to have to fight really hard to be responsible. you know, it seems kind of weird because we're always told to be responsible, but then when we really want to be responsible, it's very difficult for us to be responsible. Anyway, and then just a little bit like with that, a little bit of language that kind of goes along with my ideas of being responsible for our food and our land and all that kind of stuff. The first word, and now I'm not a language speaker. Most of the language that I've a little picked up along the way is really from the different Anishinaabe communities. My Métis background, if I look back, would be Cree. So language would be similar, but that's where the connection is. But one of the first words that really kind of connect me to these concepts is Anoknugwin, and so that word I can send you the spelling. But that word basically is the idea that within that there is agreements between humans and the land, and between humans and all the creatures that live here on Earth and beyond, and that there's different agreements, and those agreements are simply understood as how do we live together. And so at the root of our connection with creation and with our food and with the land is this idea, how do we live together? And one of the ways one language speaker kind of built on this concept was that Anoknugwin means kind of like the idea of all life gives all life to all life, or everything is committed to the process of giving life and supporting life. And so our agreements together are that idea of how do we support each other to live in a good way. And so that's kind of the first word that relates for me in being responsible, is that we have some sort of we already have some sort of agreement with that we need to uphold with the rest of creation. And then the other one is Aki Numog. And so Aki Numog is really two words put together. Aki is the word for land or earth or the world. And Numog is the idea of pointing to. And so it's the idea of that we point towards the land. And so all our knowledge and education, all the things that we need to sustain our self-governance, family, all that kind of stuff, the knowledge to understand that comes from observing the land. And so so it's that slow process of observing what's around us in order to inform us of how we then should live, how we should govern, how we should do justice, how we should live as a family, all that kind of stuff. And so those two words really have informed me over the last few years on this idea of what food and land sovereignty is. And because we don't just grow food, like we observe food as well. We're with that food trying to understand it and understand what it needs and how it will nourish us and that kind of thing as well. Hope that made sense.
I just wanted to.
I was going to say, Garrett's going to beef it up now.
No, that was really good, Dave. I think it's like that idea that we're observing the land and we're spending time on the land. When I think about Indigenous food sovereignty, the ownership over land or the control over land in the Western kind of concepts, there's not a lot of Indigenous people who own land, who have control of land. And even if we look at reserve systems, they make up less than 2% of the entire Canadian land mass. And so when we think in, you know, narrowing it down even more to an urban space, most of that land in urban spaces even are mostly privately owned, or they're owned by municipalities. And so there's not a lot of land that Indigenous people have access to in urban spaces to engage in food sovereign practices. And so when we think about food sovereignty as well, you know, I think about the control of land, access of land to be able to produce food, but then also the ability to dictate what kind of food we're producing and what kind of food we're consuming in our bodies. Lots of research shows that most urban Indigenous people eat a higher salt, fat, and sugar diet than those of their relatives who live on reserve. And so that has detrimental effects on our bodies and on our systems, and is one of the main reasons why we have so many negative numbers in the social determinants of health, mental health, heart disease, diabetes, things like that. And so moving towards a more traditional food consumption practice of corns, beans, and squash in this area, traditional game meats, other wild fruits and vegetables like pawpaw, Saskatoon berry, wild plum, and then nut trees like walnut and hickory nut and all that kind of stuff. We see a rebalancing of the good foods that are meant to sustain us within our bodies and to keep us balanced and healthy. And so when we think about Indigenous food sovereignty, it's also kind of shedding away the colonial constructs of what is healthy for your body. Not saying that there isn't, you know, European foods, for example, that can't provide the health for Indigenous people. Like, you know, if you still eat greens, you're still eating, you know, Tuscan kale or whatever, it's still going to be good for you. It's better than eating a Twinkie or whatever. But this idea of changing and understanding what we're consuming, and understanding that the growing of plants isn't just about growing food that's healthy. The health of a plant also comes from our spiritual relationship that we have with that plant. And so nurturing and coming into relationship with that plant provides a more healthy plant for consumption for us, for our bodies. We're filling ourselves not only with nutritional food, but spiritually good food for ourselves. So that's a big part, I think, of Indigenous food sovereignty, and moving away from you know, colonial food guides, for example, where we didn't drink milk and dairy products, and we didn't eat a lot of grain products like wheat, other than wild rice and things like that. So moving away from those colonial constructs of what is healthy and redefining what is a healthy consumption of food. And then being able to control how that happens when we think about Indigenous food sovereignty, we're also thinking about the changing of how one acquires food. And so traditionally somebody didn't pay for food, it was traded or it was given or it was gifted or what have you. So reestablishing those networks of sharing food and trading food is also part of Indigenous food sovereign practices as well.
So this is really helpful and a very fulsome picture. And so can you say a little bit more about, you've told us some contrasts between colonial and you know, non-Indigenous ways of thinking, but non-Indigenous food sovereignty, is that a thing? And how does that compare to what you're doing?
So yes, it is a thing. Non-Indigenous food sovereignty is an important movement that's also happening, and it helps to redefine how we access food, global food markets, how if those global food markets or global food pathways are interrupted, that we're able to feed ourselves, and that people who also don't have, for example, the funds to be able to purchase good, healthy, quality food, that they're still able to do that in our general population in our society. So non-Indigenous food sovereign practices are also really important, and being able to create community around those food practices, whether it's growing in community gardens or backyard gardens. And I think we also have to recognize that non-Indigenous people, before the engagement with the monetary economic kind of capitalist system, we're also trading and bartering and, you know, moving food in that way as well. So reestablishing those pathways are really important. I think the main difference when we're talking about Indigenous and non-Indigenous food sovereignty is what are the ontological kind of backgrounds or the ontological underpinnings that inform how we engage in those practices. So when we think about growing food, our spiritual connection is very different between from Indigenous and a non-Indigenous practice. There might be spiritual connection in non-Indigenous practices as well, but there's this there's cultural teachings and ontology that underpin all of those food practices, and why we would exchange food in certain ways or share foods, all stem from that ontological kind of worldview space. I think that's where I was going, Dave. Feel free to shoot in now.
Yeah, well, just a little history on the term food sovereignty. Well, actually came out, I think, in the late 90s as kind of as a term, and it came out of the Campesino movement out of Latin America. So in one of the world forums where people were addressing globalized economy, but not necessarily addressing what's happening at the grassroots level related to food. And so the Campesino movement came up with a presentation on food sovereignty from their perspective as small growers in Latin America, and so that's kind of where the term is rooted in, is rooted outside of the food industry that we know, the global food industry, and is really rooted in the idea of small collective or ideas of farming and cultural ideas of farming. So that's kind of the roots of it. Yeah.
I think perhaps some of our hearers will have recollections with me of hearing the word food security, but you're using food sovereignty. Can just a little bit about how those two are different, or are they the synonyms? Or
like, in my understanding, they're different in the sense that food sovereignty, like Garrison was saying, is kind of related to the whole system of food from a cultural perspective, right? Like it's the whole system, and food security is the idea of that of places where there isn't access to enough food, and so we, like in Canada and in Indigenous communities in Canada, there still exists food insecurity, where there isn't enough of the right food for people to eat, or there isn't enough, if you're living in, a neighborhood, say like downtown East Vancouver, where, it's very hard to get out to a grocery store. And so you end up eating, high carb stuff that you can get at small little grocery stores, kind of a thing. So that's food insecurity, where you're not able to actually purchase the food. And food insecurity can be related to economics as well as access as well. In most cases for Indigenous people, it's both of those things together. Yeah, so there is a difference. And one of the ways you get out of, you move away from food insecurity is to begin to, from an Indigenous perspective and an urban Indigenous perspective too, is to move towards food sovereignty, where we begin to control.
That's very helpful. Thank you. So both of you have been doing a lot of work in the KW region. What sort of things are you doing in terms of working towards food sovereignty for Indigenous folk in our areas?
So at the beginning of when I was introducing myself, we talked a bit about Wasakto Winawak which is really a collective of people working towards food sovereignty within the Waterloo Wellington area. And so that group kind of was birthed out of this little 10 by 10 garden plot that we had, and a lot of conversation around Indigenous food and stuff like that. But since that 10 by 10 plot, it's grown quite significantly, both in people involved with who we are, and in land as well. And so we don't have, it's not like we have a bunch of money and we're going out and buying land, but what we do is have a group with some significant voices. And so we've just been asking for land. So we've come up with a few significant spots, and that's providing somewhat for us, and we're kind of moving ahead with a few other situations that are going to be much more significant. But right now we have 4 gardens as Wasakta Winawak, and White Owl that I work with is a part of that collective. So my work kind of is very blurry between Wasak and White Owl, but anyway, we have 4 gardens. We have a learning garden in Blair with the Waterloo Board of Education. They have a outdoor ed center there, and so we've been able to put in a significant garden. Most of that garden was it started off with a group of us who kind of conceived the original, very tiny, almost kitchen table sized garden, and then Garrison got a hold of it, and now it's quite significant and quite a large garden, and very productive. And so that's one of our gardens. And then we have another garden at Steckley Farm in Kitchener. And that's our Three Sisters garden. That's where we grow the bulk of our corn, beans, and squash in that garden. I should say the garden at Blair is our educational garden. So it was created with the school board to bring students in and learn about Indigenous food and food sovereignty and farming kind of thing, gardening, producing food. And then Steckley is really kind of like our traditional garden, I would say, as far as food production. We have another garden up in University of Waterloo in the North Campus area, which is Columbia and Westmount, right in that area. And that's our produce garden. So that's where we grow a bulk of like greens and carrots and beets and those kinds of things. Not necessarily traditional, but good for you. And so eating good food is traditional, no matter what it is. And so that's the bulk of where we grow that kind of produce. And then we have what we call the tea garden. We wanted to call it the medicine garden, but it gets confused with some other ideas of what a medicine garden is. But the tea garden, we grow medicines and herbs and teas that we can use for tinctures and teas for our health and that kind of thing. So that's grown at the Arboretum with a connection we made with the Arboretum that's a part of the University of Guelph, and so those are our 4 main gardens. And then the White Owl a few years ago, I think 2016, I always get my dates mixed up, but I think 2016, White Owl got received from the United Church here in, mainly the United Church in Waterloo, and a plot of land, 10.5 acre plot of land that we use as our sugar bush. So maple syrup. And so so that was kind of an interesting story. The church bought this plot of land, I think, in 1968. to build a church on eventually as Kitchener grew, and that would be a place. In the early 70s, it got protected because there's a very rare salamander on that, especially in that specific area, and so it got protected, and so they would never be able to grow and build their church. And the funny thing was, so they've held on to it till 2016, and at one point they called us up as White Owl and said they had this United Church called us up and said they had a donation for us, and if we would share a little with a Sunday school class, and then receive the donation. So we said yeah. And so Michelle, the other co-ED with White Owl, went and shared. It's really short, like it's almost like a minute and a half. You did a little share, and then they gave you this a little donation for us to run a camp. And when that was all done, one of the elders of the church was walking Michelle out the door, and he said, "If there's anything we can do for you, just let us know." And she just blurted out without thinking, "Yeah, you can give us some land." And the guy was like, "Oh, just sit down here for a sec. I might be able to give you something, I might be able to be the answer to that request." So he ran off and got another guy, and they came back and they said, "Yeah, we've been holding on to this land for whatever it was, 40 years, and maybe we can make out a deal." So I think about a year went through of doing all the legal stuff, and one summer we gave them a loonie, and they gave us a rock, and we had a deal where we owned 10.5 acres in it's a mixed forest, but there's a lot of maple trees in it. So it's so we have now a land where we're looking after the Jefferson salamander and producing maple syrup. So it's a cool story.
I can share what we're doing at the college real quick. So at the college, we have a small plot of land that we are looking after. We have an NSERC grant, and we're looking after that plot of land. It's a 100 by 100 foot plot. But Dave and I are working on a project with the city of Kitchener and with the Conestoga College to do an 88-acre restoration process at a piece of land just along the Walter Bean Trail at Pioneer Tower. And so there's a big giant piece of farmland there, and just some riverbank land. And so we're engaging in the development of a 33-acre urban Indigenous farm, all kind of permaculturally developed and using some Indigenous agricultural methods from other countries, other territories, but also from this territory, growing Indigenous foods, but also that those kind of market greens. And then developing community process around that. So doing the work of planting things, growing things, tending them, harvesting, and then also processing whatever food that we do harvest. So having community be a part of that. We'll also be setting up trap lines there. We're currently in conversation with the Sportsman Club that's just on the other side of the property to do some hunting of larger game with archery with some of our urban Indigenous youth. And so that's a big project, and we're tying in this idea of growing food, developing food sovereign practices, but while also still talking about how do we live in relationship with the land. So that the fullness of that land, that full 88 acres, will be about developing forests and meadow spaces that promote food production in the natural area. So not just us cultivating things, but the land producing and us coming into relationship and harvesting and so on. And that garden alone is going to be able to produce about 1/6 of the needed food to address urban Indigenous food insecurity in the region. So a large, substantial amount of food. And this is one of the first projects in the country, actually, to really start doing this urban Indigenous food practice at a large scale like that, while integrating kind of the interrelationship between Indigenous science and Western environmental science to develop a more ecologically sound space, an urban space where both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people can come together and learn from one another. That's what we're doing at the college anyway.
Well, it sounds fabulous. Thank you for sharing all of those pieces. I can imagine and see all of those spaces in some way, and now I'm curious to go and look and see where these gardens are and spaces are. You talked a little bit about sharing, how important the community part of sharing the food. Can you say a little bit about how that looks?
Yeah. Like, I think it goes back to what we talked about earlier. And like part of our, so in our Indigenous ideas, sharing becomes the priority. So if we look at Indigenous ideas of economics, then the basis of Indigenous economics is reciprocity and sharing, right? And so that becomes the priority. So we're not always answering the question, how do we make money out of these adventures, or even maybe to our detriment, but I don't think so. We don't, how do we economically self-sustain ourselves, right? And be self-sustaining. Anyway, but sharing comes first. And so this year we produced, out of our gardens, we produced probably about 3,500 pounds of food. Not huge, but as I've been told, like an average amount for the space that we're actually gardening, and we've been able to share that with the community, like whoever would like to. And so basically, since August, there's been 20 households outside of our work group, or even outside of our collective, that the working collective that we're involved with, 20 other households who've received food on a weekly basis. And so and then we've been able to keep that up. We had our own food up until into November, and then after that we've been able to keep that kind of going with some other foods that we've either purchased or have been donated. Yeah, so that idea of sharing, and that's really what I think, like, again, from our perspective too, like, community for us, or the collective for us, is a little bit different than I think the Western collective. So for us, the collective or the community is who we are. So we're individuals within the collective. We're individuals within that community. Where in the Western idea, typically it's you're an individual first, and then you maybe, or you have the opportunity to belong to collectives or communities. And because of that priority of community, that begins to inform, like, a lot of our, what we would say economic decisions or political decisions or governance or whatever, because that collective becomes a priority. So I think that's, now I can't remember the question, but I believe I'm answering it.
Yes. Yeah, I was wanting to know about the sharing part, so you're definitely hearing that. Yeah.
I think there's important underlying pieces about, like, when Dave was talking about we are the collective. When I think about, like, knowledge sharing and how our youth continue to know these skills and knowledge about these food practices, there's lots of work that I've read that talks about the harm that's happened through the de-skilling of our young people. And so when they stop understanding how to grow food, how to save food, how to cook food. That's one of the things that we've been growing this food, and then we give people the food and they're like, what am I supposed to do with this? I don't know how to cook corn. I don't know how to do this kind of stuff. And this is a product of that de-skilling. And so a big part of our sharing isn't just about sharing food. I mean, that is a big part of it, but a big part of beyond that is about how do we teach people how to do this work? How do we reintroduce our practices? So we've had youth go and clean a deer, and what part of the meat do we do? How do we do it? What do we do with the hide after we're done that? How do we turn that, and how does that go from the animal's body into our drum? How do we take corn, grow corn? How do we wake the seeds up? All these really important pieces don't just happen from somebody paying for food or somebody reading it in a book. It's actually about the engagement as a collective and sharing the knowledge, because I don't know everything, Dave doesn't know everything. And so when we bring in the collective, there's this constant sharing that happens. And that's also how we've acquired our seeds to grow this food. It's come from sharing amongst all these people. Last year I grew blue corn. That was the first year that we've ever grown blue corn, and that was received from Andrew Judge. And then, you know, Dave acquired white corn, was growing Mohawk white corn from, I think Fran gave you that, right, Dave? And so there's this, how we're actually growing food is directly related to the sharing of seeds and knowledge from the collective. So.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing those things. Very helpful to understand some of the ontology you were talking about earlier, Garrison, that there's a whole way of thinking behind how Indigenous food sovereignty is understood. It's very helpful. Thank you.
So in Indigenous futurities, what does that word mean, and how's it play in all of this work you're doing?
Want me to take a stab, Dave?
Yep, that's your favorite word.
That's my favorite word. It's a futurity is the ability to dream or imagine something in the future. And when we think about Indigenous futurities, it's the ability for Indigenous people to dream and imagine and envision what the future, what our future looks like. And when we think about an Indigenous futurity, it takes into account sovereignty and sustainability and sharing and all of these very big ontological underlying questions and thoughts and practices. And it's about reciprocity, you know, so on. And what we're competing with as Indigenous people is a settler colonial futurity. And the settler colonial futurity doesn't take into account Indigenous people and Indigenous practices. It's the difference between colonialism and settler colonialism is, you know, the colonialism is this idea that we're a colony, this Canada's a colony, and that there is still this motherland, and we're going to take all from this colony and send it back to this homeland. But settler colonialism is a change from the colony to, we're going to now subsume everything that's here, and we're going to make it the homeland. We're going to, you know, completely change and erase the colonial discourse, and we're going to make this the settler native land, not Indigenous people. And so settler colonialist or colonial futurity is, you know, mostly interested in the complete erasure of an Indigenous conversation. But an Indigenous futurity doesn't exclude settlers from the conversation about what does the future look like, because it's deeply relational. And we understand that, you know, people who have lived here for generations aren't just going to pack up and go back to places that they've never been to before. But it's how do we live in relationship with another and honor the practices from this territory, but also allow settler people to honor the practices that are going on for them inside of them as well. But living in relationship. And it's going back to that two-road wampum belt. It's going back to the dish with one spoon wampum treaty, and understanding that there's important differences, those ontological differences that I was talking about as well, that are going to inform how we walk forward, and an acknowledgement of that. Another big thing about that Indigenous futurity is not, you know, if you ask most Indigenous people, I think if you said, you know, we're going to go back to living in teepees and wigwams and stuff like that, they'd be like, not a heckin' million, right? That's not going to happen. So how do we also use some of this technology and this these practices that are exemplified in Western thought and practice to also help inform the way we go forward? So when we think about an Indigenous futurity, we might be thinking about what does a net zero community look like, while also being able to grow food and engage in food sovereign practices, while still having solar panels and electric cars and, you know, all this kind of stuff that allows us to be in better relationship with the land, but also be able to do the things that we still want to do, and allow time for art and language and other things that make life good and good living. But that Indigenous futurity really it's not about erasing things. It's not about saying what we're against. It's about saying what we're for, and developing that Indigenous food in terms of Indigenous food sovereignty, developing a more holistic food sovereign practice, both in urban spaces and in rural communities, that not only positively affect Indigenous lives, but also non-Indigenous people's lives.
I think one way to, so when we say the word community, which we've used a little bit here, so in our concepts too, like the idea of community is not something that's just happening now. So community is all our ancestors that came before us, and community is all our relatives that will go after us as well. And community is also, and when we make that statement, it's not just human ancestors and it's the and a human future, it's the future of all things. And so that's included within our understanding. So this idea of a future, which I think we're typically in a settler colonial, and in the colonial idea, we're stuck historically as a people, and stuck at in a time like a historical time. Whether we're Métis or First Nations or Inuit, the idea is that we are a people of the past. And so even when we talk about urbanization, Indigenous people don't have a future in the city, because we're still supposed to be a rural kind of living off the land kind of a thing. And so the future for us is urban, as well as rural, and as well as reserve and that kind of a thing. But that's our reality, is that we do have a future, and we're moving towards that future, and the future doesn't look like our past. And even though often people are trying to hold us to that past.
So the Indigenous food sovereignty is pretty critical to that vision of this futurity that you're describing. Then it's really,
I think it is. And I think it's also important that when we were talking about, we can't be food sovereign if we don't have access to land. And then when we get access to land, we bring up conversations about what is Indigenous governance or co-management. So all these conversations can really start emerging from this process of food sovereignty. And we're already seeing that in how we're negotiating with the city and with other institutions around doing the work. The work that we're doing with the city is the city saying, this is your vision, and this is a place for Indigenous community. So Indigenous community needs to be the one that drives how this restoration project is going to work, and then what use the land is going to have. And then, so that's opened up conversations around what does governance and co-management of land look like, walking into the future.
Thank you. This has really been an incredible conversation. We're going to keep the conversation going, but thanks again for this, and looking forward to what people have to say.
Thank you both.